Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the Executive Director of the NACBS, and I want to thank you for joining us to hear more about the solidarity economy. I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests, and then I will turn it over to them to get started. So, Tehila Sasson is a historian of the British Empire with a particular interest in the histories of ethics, the economy, and decolonization. So she's currently an assistant professor at Emory, but I think just now in fall of 2024, she will be joining the University of Oxford as an associate professor of modern history and as a fellow at Wadham College. So I think you just started that. Congratulations. Today we'll be hearing about her first book, The Solidarity Economy, Nonprofits and the Making of Neoliberalism After Empire, which was published with Princeton University Press. And Sasson has also written on the histories of consumerism, corporate social responsibility, humanitarianism, famine, relief, and neoliberalism in the American Historical Review, Past and Present, and the Journal of British Studies, among other places. And so she's going to be joined today in conversation by Erik Linstrum, who is a historian of modern Britain and its imperial, European, and global context. His research explores the politics of knowledge and the circulation of information, with particular interests in science and technology, war and violence, and the long history of decolonization. His first book, Ruling Minds, Psychology in the British Empire, won the George Louis Beer Prize of the American Historical Association. And his most recent work is Age of Emergency, Living with Violence at the End of the British Empire. And so with that, I will turn it over to you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. Thank you all for being here. Nice to see friends and colleagues at what is an early hour here in California, but I know I might be alone on the West Coast. I'm not sure. So greetings and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. I'm so pleased to be here, to be in conversation with Tehila, talking about her fabulous new book, The Solidarity Economy. So the way we're going to work this is that I'm going to offer a very brief introduction, gloss reading of Tehila's book from my own perspective. And Tehila and I will then be in conversation. I think it'll be pretty informal. I have some questions I want to ask, but I hope it will sort of unfold as an organic conversation. And then we will turn to Q&A. I think the timing of that is a little up in the air, but we want to have a good conversation first. So please, if you do have a question, something that occurs to you, go ahead and raise your hand or drop it in the chat, however you'd like to do that. And I would just encourage you to do that whenever the question occurs to you, because I'll sort of be keeping an eye on that. And when we turn to the Q&A will partly be determined by how fast they're accumulating. But in any case, we'll converse and then get to questions. So please be patient in the meantime. Okay, so let's get started. Tehila Sasson's book, The Solidarity Economy, is the story of how left liberals learned to love the market. This was, to be sure, a particular vision of the market, the kind associated with slogans like fair trade, ethical consumption, small is beautiful, and corporate responsibility. Above all, as the title of the book suggests, the 1960s and 70s saw the crystallization of the idea that new heights of global solidarity could be achieved through capitalism with a human face. According to this way of thinking, it was not the centralized Keynesian state, but the coordinated activity of small-scale producers and individual consumers that would mitigate inequality between rich and poor nations. It was not the high modernism of industrial infrastructure, but the handicrafts made in workshops and households that would fulfill the egalitarian promise of decolonization. It was not the nationalization or even the regulation of corporations, but the well-intentioned mobilization of so-called stakeholders that would curb the exploitation of workers. So, in addressing the perennial question of how the market triumphed over the state in the second half of the 20th century, Sasson reveals that the usual division between right and left is utterly misleading. Many of the most influential champions of the market, she shows, were impeccably progressive and motivated above all by ethical commitments to the rest of humanity. While the promise of this humanized and moralistic capitalism has repeatedly proven illusory, Sasson writes, quote, "It is a fiction that continues to reproduce economic disparities, even as it ceaselessly promises to overcome itself through new forms of non-governmental solidarity." Now, the phrase after empire in the subtitle of the book provides another important clue to its contributions. The dissolution of formal colonies did not, of course, abruptly end Britain's connections with the rest of the world, but it did reset the terms of those relationships and generate new questions. Should British involvement with Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean be understood as moral obligation or voluntary altruism? As a product of historically rooted political and economic systems, or through the fuzzier ecological logic of small planet and spaceship Earth? Ultimately, as a matter of structure or a matter of choice? On this last point, at least, the solidarity economy is clear that the individual consumer was envisioned as a central and perhaps the central agent of post-imperial ethics. Decisions about where to shop, what to buy, what to wear, what to eat became modes of participating in a moral universe unmoored from the institutional machinery of state-centered imperialism. In some ways, the solidarity economy is an intellectual history. It shows how an eclectic range of influences, from utilitarian moral philosophy to Quaker paternalism to Gandhian thought, underwrote attempts to infuse economic life with moral purpose. Thinkers who remain prominent today, like the philosopher Peter Singer, are situated alongside those who probably deserve to be better known, such as Barbara Ward and E.F. Schumacher. But for all her supple and sensitive treatment of ideas, there's really nothing abstract or hermetic about her treatment of them in the book. This is rather a history of ideas in action. The book is just as attentive to institutions as to ideas and to the stories told in institutional archives. Above all, the archives of nonprofit NGOs like Oxfam, although to some extent government agencies like the Ministry of Overseas Development, and quangos like the Overseas Development Institute come into the story as well. Moving seamlessly between scales, the solidarity economy moves from trade agreements and debt negotiations to the charity shop on the corner, from seminar rooms and international conferences to the dinner table, from Britain to India to the UN and the IMF and back again. Along the way, and I want to end here, the book makes a strong case for thinking about the rise of neoliberalism with and through the experience of decolonization. To explain Britain's seemingly dramatic lurch from social democracy to consumerist and financialized capitalism, Sasson suggests, we must consider the longing for moral meaning in a world without empire. Right, so that's my gloss on the book. I'm sort of looking forward to hearing if Tehila agrees or thinks I've left out important things or would like to add more. But I think maybe the way to proceed would just be to ask a question, Tehila, if I might. And a reminder that you're muted, by the way. I think that the point I mean, there's so much to talk about. I want to talk about decolonization. I want to talk about neoliberalism, the big kind of conceptual gorillas in the room. But I think maybe the way to start is to ask about decolonization in a particular way. I just use this phrase post-imperial ethics, and I wonder sort of what you think about that phrase. But more to the point, I guess, is it possible, do you think, to speak of post-imperial ethics? Because you show in the book there's a range of possible responses to the question of what Britain owed or owes to its former imperial subjects. So some figures in the book, like the economist Barbara Ward, who almost reads more as an ethicist than an economist, but we can talk more about that too. Some were quite explicit about the historical connection between imperialism and inequality. But others, and I think here that ecological turn of the 1960s and the idea of spaceship Earth becomes important, seem to be expressing a more voluntary and altruistic attitude that doesn't really see a moral connection between the imperial past and inequality in the present. So how would you summarize the relationship between decolonization and ethics? What are the range of positions being expressed here? And is it even possible to generalize about that?
Yeah, well, first I should start by saying thank you. Well, thank you to Amanda and to NACBS for hosting this, and thank you, Erik. This was better than I could have put it, so I really appreciate this, and I appreciate you doing this event and for the questions. All right, so post-imperial ethics, or the relationship between decolonization and ethics, I think it's a really good question, which I don't know if I have one way of answering it. There's ways in which I think decolonization animates various ideas about the moral and ethical obligation Britain has towards its empire. And there's ways in which there are some of these conversations come within Britain, like from people like Barbara Ward. But I think that there's like a general kind of international conversation about the end of empire that animates the story for me. So, you know, the main actors are really, as you said, are NGOs, and the ways in which ideas that they read and were inspired by were put into action through various types of programs. Whether it was fair trade of food and handicraft, whether it was through corporate social responsibility, whether it is microfinance, all of these programs in a way are set to critique the relationship between Britain and its empire, or Britain and its former empire, or decolonizing empire, as well as a certain type of inequalities in the global economy. So sometimes it doesn't exactly match, but they're motivated, and the spirit behind them is inspired by conversations that are happening in the international order, like through the NIO, for example. What I'm trying to do is to both kind of locate the origins of the ways in which some of these ideas were located within particular conversations that have to do with decolonization. So the ways in which economists like Yves Schumacher both came from a particular discussion about public ownership that we normally associate very much with domestic conversations in Britain, but also through, and that those conversations were not necessarily disconnected from kind of broader ideas about new post-colonial economies. So in that case, you know, ideas that Yves Schumacher developed about decentralization and small is beautiful were not necessarily just a matter of like the moral responsibility that Britain has towards its empire, but they were very much inspired by decolonization as this kind of new moment in which we can imagine new economic relationship. And he was reading post-colonial thinkers, you know, and like critics like Gandhi and like the followers of Gandhi to think about this relationship and the way in which it could even apply to Britain. So it wasn't just about between Britain and the world, but also the way in which we can reform Britain itself and ideas about public ownership within Britain itself. And at the same time, there are various other programs like the ones that I follow, for example, with microfinance, which the critique of structural adjustment programs, which I think are very much rooted within and inspired by really a certain type of moral obligation and ethical obligation that Britain has towards its former empire, especially in the Caribbean, and how structural adjustment programs cannot really rectify those inequalities, and that Britain has a particular responsibility in the world economy and in the world order to rethink a certain type of economic relationship through various types of development programs to its former colonies. So does that answer it?
Yeah, it begins to, but I think it leaves lots more to.
Yeah, I mean,
which is good. So, I do think you brought out well this idea of decolonization as a moment of possibility, right? And I was also thinking of the influence of Gandhi, the Gandhian model, which is so interesting. And you know, at least I had not thought about Gandhianism kind of making a comeback in serious economic thought in the 60s and 70s in the British context. So that was quite new to me, at least, and I think is quite fascinating. It begins to lead into one other question I wanted to get to. I still have many, but which is just sort of why there is in left liberal circles, and I think that's the right label, but you can certainly come back at me on that if you'd like to, why there is this growing dissatisfaction with a kind of Keynesian consensus and with ideas of development, the kind of industrialization, modernization model of development associated with figures like Arthur Lewis. Because obviously one of the big contributions of the book is to show that the call is coming from inside the house, and that this sort of Keynesian consensus, if we can call it that, really was being critiqued by leftists who were dissatisfied with its impersonality, its sort of lack of regard for community. So I'm already starting to answer the question there, but tell us a little more about, why there is this growing discontent and what it looks like.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, yeah, so the book sort of tries to locate that kind of different types of programs of fair trade that I just mentioned, different types of alternatives within a particular conversation in Britain in the 1950s about ownership, and the way in which social democracy, I think sometimes it's called, but like the way, I mean, I think public ownership kind of captures, or thinking about public ownership maybe captures it better, the way in which it should be managed, the way in which the economy should be managed. And I located within particular conversations within British socialism and what some people like Ben Jackson called ethical socialism, this turn towards ethical socialism. Ethical socialism is the idea that, we shouldn't just think about managing the economy through GNP, from top down, not just through the state because of that, but through various types of much more local, decentralized kind of modes of organization, like the community or the consumer. So Michael Young is one version of this, and it's kind of the more known version of this. What I tried to do is I tried to locate this story about ethical socialism, which historians have already been writing about. I tried to locate and place it within kind of a broader moment and discussions about development in the international economy and in period of decolonization. So I think that, what I'm trying to show you, tell me if I managed to do it successfully, is the people like Young, like Titmuss, and like Schumacher is written about less, are thinking about questions about economic management and public ownership, who owns the economy and who represents the economy, not by just thinking about the British state itself and this kind of very insular domestic discussion about social democracy, but by thinking constantly about the newly decolonized post-colonial economies, and especially India is really, really important here. Titmuss was like very much involved in other stories in Africa as well. And I tried to show that all of them were in one way or another invested and visited different types of places and economies, thinking about it through various places. So yeah, so India was really important for that, and trying to think about different ways in which Britain could reorganize its own economy by looking at thinkers like Gandhi and thinking about ownership not only through the state, but through the community, I think, would be kind of one of the more obvious ways in which it was answered by these people. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense.
I drifted into like
no,
but I forgot what
I was just thinking as you were talking though, because India is so important. There's obviously a tension there, right? Because leaders of Congress, Nehru in particular, famously is very invested in a kind of high modernist idea of industrial modernization. So at precisely the moment that's sort of the aid, that's the kind of development model that someone like Nehru was looking for. You have these British thinkers coming in and saying, "Hey, let's go back to the Gandhian spinning wheel." I mean, how does that tension play out, or how does that sort of lead to certain kinds of friction or misunderstanding? Maybe is another way of asking that question.
Yeah, I mean, so in many ways, these are just like the intellectual origins of something that comes into effect really in the 1970s during a moment of crisis, right? So maybe to kind of explain this for kind of a broader audience or like a broader narrative, this fits within a story of, we normally think of, as I think you phrase it really nicely, of the market trumps the state, as a story that comes out of the neoliberal right and out of conversations about it from, let's say, the Tory party, the Conservative Party, or neoliberal economists. And what I'm trying to show is that in the 1950s, there were all these liberal socialists, that were thinking about alternatives to the state And those alternatives were always in relationship or in relationship to the market. And they were not thinking about it in the same way that we would normally tag it as neoliberal, but they were critics of the state and of state management of the economy. And what I'm trying to do is to show that in the 50s that, you know, all these thinkers came out of this moment of particular British socialism, inspired or in the context of high modernism, so in the context of, you know, everyone is turning towards large modernization projects and development. These critics were thinking about different ways of organizing both development in post-colonial economies as well as the British economy. So they were very much invested, and I think it came out of the energy for that actually didn't come necessarily from post-colonial economies, but the energy from that came from particular conversations in Britain, and they looked to post-colonial economies or discussions within those economies as ways in which they can rethink about the British economy. And these types of ideas influence, you know, and were read by nonprofits in the 60s and the early 70s, and in a moment where the development industry, if you want to call it like that, in the early 1970s was in crisis, and the crisis was, you know, global economic downturn, global unemployment. The moment that it was in crisis, then these ideas really came into practice and gained a lot of energy and became very popular. And a lot of these nonprofits that were already practicing, some of them from the early 60s, suddenly became really important. So Oxfam is a good example of a nonprofit that, you know, was founded in 42, but it was actually 42, you know, but it was really kind of became big and important from the 70s onwards, because that's the moment in which a lot of these ideas that were looking at much more community level, intermediate technology, small scale, consumer action, suddenly became popular because the development industry was in crisis.
Yeah. No, that's great. And again, so many possible ways to follow up, which is a challenge for me. I guess one thing I'm wondering is how your story would look different, or how it would fit into the conversation around migration and decolonization. Because it occurs to me, and this sort of comes back to the issue of ethics, it occurs to me that one way of reading this period is this is a moment when Britain is actually quite actively and hurriedly dissolving all kinds of formal legal obligations to its subjects and former subjects, right? It's rolling back, or it's shrinking the ambit of citizenship. When there are refugee crises in places like East Africa, it's very eager to redefine these affected groups as refugees rather than as British subjects. So actual legal formal obligations are dissolving or consciously being dissolved. And yet, at the same moment, you have many individuals, institutions in Britain who want to cultivate these kind of affective ties of, well, let's help someone in Africa by buying a handicraft at a shop, or maybe by going to a party where most of the people at the party will be eating soup instead of roast beef, because that's how most people eat. So we're sort of raising awareness and saving food at the same time. In other words, there's a kind of inverse relationship between the formal legal obligation and the affective, voluntaristic, altruistic dimension. So migration is just one way of getting at that, I guess. But how do you read that? And as I say, maybe I'm just asking the question of ethics again in a different way. But does that make sense to you, or do you see more of a more robust effort to enforce obligations at this time, among your actors?
Yeah, no, I love the intersection, or the way you think about it through the literature and what we know about citizenship and the contractual relationship. So I guess we mentioned before alternatives, and the way I think about decolonization as a moment of various alternatives. And I'm very much, I think, I'm inspired by a certain type of literature that doesn't think about decolonization as this kind of, or the end of empire, as a story that is a genealogical story that just leads to one type of. The story in the book doesn't just try to show how empire just remained with us, but more the ways in which the end of empire itself is a moment, and by moment I mean a process, reconfigured a certain relationship in which there is residual relationship to empire, but also transformed and created new relationships. So I want to say first that, and by saying that, I then want to say that there's various types of alternatives that are being put forward. And what I try to do, sometimes I fail to do that. What I try to do is I try to trace certain type of alternatives that were available and possible and were entertained. So for example, in the case of fair trade of food, I look at various types of programs in the late 60s and early 70s in which activists try to create new types of commodity agreements, new types of kind of much more structural relationships. And every time that there is a new attempt to create new structural relationship, what I show is that those attempts fail. And instead, what NGOs and nonprofits like Oxfam stuck with, I mean, some of it has to do with the fact of who were those nonprofits. And so Oxfam just took a much more kind of marketized approach to that. But, but they ended up kind of relying on a much more altruistic, voluntary, and individualistic, right? So individualism is really important here. Yeah. Or individualization. I don't know if we want to call it like that. But instead of having structural changes or reparations, if we want to call it like that, between Britain and its former empire, a lot of the programs that did end up sticking and did end up kind of becoming much bigger and developing were programs that focused on individuals. So either the consumer through ethical consumption or the producer through a certain type of, producerism, if you want to call it, like a certain type of like new forms of production, or even making entrepreneurs, or through the corporation or the trust as a certain type of new type of individual, a new type of that is tasked with this kind of ethical relationship. Now, in addition to that, if I might add, is those ethical relationships are being signaled and marked, and I showed over time that they change from being something between Britain and its former empire to, by the early 80s, between Britain and the underdeveloped world, what we call today the global south, right? Like something that participates actively in a certain type of imperial amnesia and creates, I mean, I think that the term that I use in the book, and I think is probably the best, is the third world. But the third world as this kind of like monolithic kind of block that is underdeveloped, and therefore it is our moral obligation. So by the early 1980s, it's the individual consumer in Britain thinking about their ethical obligation, not towards somebody in a former colony, like in India, that they have to, then buy a certain handicraft, product, but by some underdeveloped, or a poor person in Gujarat that they want to buy a certain thing to help them. You know what I mean? Like, so it's an attempt to show how that kind of imperial amnesia is created through a lot of fair trade and programs and corporate social responsibility programs.
No, that's really helpful there. Yeah, there is a kind of redefinition there. Do you use the term amnesia in the book? As it strikes me, it's a very powerful way. It's probably there somewhere. That's a very powerful way of thinking about this relationship. As I indicated in my remarks earlier, I was also very struck. We don't need to get into this deeply now, but I was very struck by the role of ecology in that refashioning of how one thinks about the rest of the world and the needs of the rest of the world. It's kind of redefined in sort of neo-Malthusian ecological terms. There are finite resources. We have a lot. They don't have a lot. But that's almost a way of naturalizing the inequality, right? It really removes it from the plane of history and political economy. So I think that was a really fascinating dimension of your argument. I see Jane Kennedy has made a comment that's right on the point of what we're talking about. So I'll go ahead and read it and get your response. Dane asks, I wonder how these British thinkers responded to third world critics of the post-colonial global economy, rule, Prebisch, et cetera, which culminated in the NIEO of 1974. And of course, you talk about NIEO in the book. So what's...
Yeah, and I also, thanks, Dane. So actually, a lot of these activists and aid workers were reading Prebish and were very much influenced by dependency theories, and we're thinking through that. So even the more kind of market-driven solutions, like the one Oxfam developed for fair trade, which was fair trade of handicraft. There's a program called the Bridge Program that was meant to bridge the gap between consumers in Britain and producers in the global South, and a lot of the early emphasis was around India. That entire program was very much, at least in the footnotes and the archives, you see that they're really reading Prebish, and they were trying to think of a certain type of dependency and how to underwrite that, or undo that dependency by not going through the state, but by connecting indirectly, connecting directly without the state and without international trade agreements, which of course is ridiculous, if you think about, the certain type of critique that Prebish and the NIO are talking about. But they were thinking how we can connect those two individuals directly without the intervention of the state. So they're definitely influenced by that and are reading that, and the footprints of the NIO is all over their archives in many ways, and not just the thinkers, but also the aid workers that are not always real thinkers, but they are influenced by a certain type of political and economic conversation that is happening, whether it is in the UN, but also within the development world, very much in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that comes across very well in the book is that it's not as if more radical critiques are not there and more radical sort of options are not there. They are there. They're being discussed. Whether it's the NIEO and sort of price floor for commodities on the global market or whatever it might be, the sort of structural radical solutions are there. They just often are foreclosed, right? And they're sort of crowded out by the kinds of ideas that you focus on. I've got more to ask. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have questions, go ahead, raise your hand, drop it in the chat. We'll turn to those shortly. And I honestly do have so many things to ask. I'm not sure where to turn. I guess I'll ask about the nation versus the transnational dimensions of what you're talking about. This is kind of an inevitable question, I guess. Your book is obviously very attentive to the wider transnational context of these ideas, which I think is great. There's especially a kind of Anglo-American flavor to a lot of what you're looking at, which is maybe something we could discuss. But I wonder if you would just say more about the British particularity or not of your story, or how a British story fits into a larger history of neoliberalism. Something that kept occurring to me as I was reading, and I imagine had occurred to you too at one point, if only unconsciously, were the parallels with Dan Rogers' story in Age of Fracture, this idea of breaking down sort of Keynesian aggregates and thinking more about individualistic models of behavior and action. Of course, that's a very United States story that he tells, and it's more focused on the 80s and the 70s, but particularly the 80s than anything else. So I guess this is just my way of asking, how do you think about the nation or the British world as a unit of analysis? What is your unit of analysis geographically, and how does it?
And at this point, I don't know anything.
Do you need one? But you get what I'm getting at. What's the relationship between the British and the wider world?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really hard question, I realized.
The truth is the book was written a year ago. At this point, who knows? No, but I'll try and properly answer the question. I guess there's ways in which maybe I first answer it by saying what's particularly British about this story, and about the story of I guess the story that I'm telling is adding to a certain literature, as I said, about neoliberalism, but within that story about neoliberalism, there's certain strands that look at individualism, and I don't think it's just Rogers, but I guess I'm drawing a lot from people like Florence Sutcliffe,
Yes.
Cartwright, for example, and John Lawrence. They're looking at individualism. I mean, there's ways in which British historians have looked at the role of the individual.
Mhm.
So individualization or individualism is, I think, something that historians of Britain thinking about the economy and thinking about the story of what happens to social democracy in this period are thinking through. But I'm trying to put it in conversation with, or I'm thinking about Britain always in relationship to its empire and through its global relationship. I guess I was trained like that, but also my archives are very much thinking through that. So I can't think about it just within Britain because my archives are already kind of taking me to
Right.
other places. It's funny to think about the nation in many ways because the unit here is, it's British, but it's nonprofits, and it's nonprofits critiquing the state. They're critiquing the state in a different way that neoliberal economists like Milton Friedman would critique the state. So they're thinking about decentralization, which is very different, and community. So there's many ways in which, they fit within a very particular left-wing story, right? But they're still thinking about the kind of British version of this. So for them, there's particular ways in which the story is British is that their critique of development, their critique of the economy in this period is a critique that says, there's ways in which the Americans are doing it, which is through large modernization programs. And the Americans always, emphasize just the consumer, just like, the corporation. We want to create ways in which the consumer and the corporation would work within the community through stakeholder capitalism. And there's ways in which they're influenced by discussions within socialism, but they're not like the Soviets. So they want to create a certain type of middle path, which is really important for them, like a British way of doing it. I'm not saying that's necessarily like a peculiar British story, but I think that they are making that case in their in their own way. So like organizations like Intermediate Technologies Development Group, for example, Oxfam, I think in the 60s and 70s are making the case that they're different from what's available out there because they are nonprofits. So they're not necessarily represent, even if they take some funding from the state, they're not driven by policymakers. And they're there to represent a certain type of stakeholder capitalism that would put together both the consumer in the West, let's say, but especially in Britain, because they work through first through British businesses and through British organizations, and the producer in the global South, the former empire, particularly, and the global community. So that's how they see themselves. Even the most left wing of these nonprofits, Warren Want, also sees itself like that. And when Warren Want leads like a series of campaigns to boycott different types of corporations, they see themselves as representatives of this type of stakeholder capitalism, and a particularly British kind of representative of it, that holds a certain type of British accountability against British corporations, but also multinational corporations. So they're representing a certain type of like moral obligation. We're back to ethics, I feel like.
Yeah, back to ethics. No, that's probably where our work overlaps actually, so it makes sense. It's interesting that you mentioned the American model as kind of a foil, because of course you have a similar critique that emerges within the American context, and the whole history of community development that Dan Immerwahr has written about is of course very much in that tradition, thinking small, as he says. So there are all kinds of connections and parallels that I think are really fascinating to explore. Let's turn to a question from the chat. We have a question from Michelle Toussaint. Can you talk about the legacies of this transformation in a post-Brexit world, particularly in light of a consumption that seems to focus more on British-made goods? Yeah, indeed.
Oh. I don't know if I can. I mean, there's a particular way in which one of the chapters looks at an attempt to create certain type of new commodity agreements with the Caribbean for to protect Caribbean producers, sugar producers in the Caribbean, with the argument that Britain has a certain type of moral obligation towards these producers because of the long history of slavery. And therefore, even though Britain is, moving to the European community, it still needs to maintain a certain type of quantity of sugar that it buys from the Caribbean in order to support Caribbean development, because basically Britain kind of restructured the Caribbean economy to a singular commodity. So I look and I explore how these kind of campaigns for commodity agreements, especially of sugar, were happening during the in 73, during the kind of period that Britain kind of joins the common market. But how, this sort of failed in many ways, partially because there was a sugar crisis, and how they ended up turning into different types of like individual consumerist mode of activism by encouraging consumers, to buy certain type of fair trade of food instead of like creating kind of a more structural changes. But I don't know if I have something particularly like in the way in which these legacies stay today, because I think that in many ways the entire conversation post-Brexit about how to buy British-made goods is very much kind of an very, very much against this moment. It's very much a domestic producers rather than any type of imperial legacies. Yeah. I actually don't know if it's a necessarily imperial legacy, because I think that there is a lot of commodities that are actually coming now. If you just go to Sainsbury's, they're coming actually from the former empire when you buy, maybe more than they would have before. I actually wouldn't know.
Sorry. I think I'm right in saying in your book that, there's really very little attention paid by these thinkers to the idea of production in Britain. The idea of the producer is very sort of offshored, right? The Britain is the consumer, and your third worlder, for lack of a better term, is the producer. It's a very kind of binary, relationship that they're articulating, which is interesting. And also, yeah, go ahead.
In many ways, it's sort of an attempt to understand how fair trade kind of or at least part of the story kind of looks at how fair trade reproduced that type of workshop of the world. That this type of like idea that Britain consumes and the empire is producing. So in the case of handicrafts, a lot of these programs are trying to encourage producers to even include like notes about how what they made is authentic. There's certain types of like workshops that they give to producers in Gujarat about how to create hentai products. So they actually don't want to diversify a lot of the products, and they want to create a certain niche market of authentic crafts that are being produced by the third world, and to be consumed by Britain itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. And actually, I think there's a way in which your story sort of maps on well to David Edgerton's, narrative about a kind of nationalized Britain at mid-century, which globalizes later in the 20th century. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just now, because we have two meaty questions at least coming in our remaining 15 minutes. So let's turn to those. The next is from Nadia Durbach. She says, "I was interested that Erik described your work as intellectual history." So you can object to that or not, Tehila. Can you talk about what methodologies shape your arguments and how you think about the type of history you are writing? Are these types of categories helpful or constraining?
Thanks, Nadia. This is, I wrote this book over time, and I've changed over that time. So some chapters are more me as a social historian, social and cultural historian, and some of them are definitely kind of more intellectual history. So I don't know if I was definitely inspired by intellectual history by the time I finished writing the book. I say that because I think that there were ways in which intellectual history helped me understand or answer certain questions that I couldn't answer by looking just at the social history, which is where I started the project. So, I was my formation is much more thinking about economic life through social and cultural history. But as I was working on these archives, I saw a lot of different types of footnotes, stuff that they read, and I tried to understand like what was the kind of overarching kind of ideas. Why were they trying to create these various programs, and what connect them together, and what motivated them? And for that, I needed to kind of look at the type of and what was the politics, I guess, also to understand the politics of a lot of these programs. I went and I started reading about the different types of ideas. So a lot of them referred to Schumacher, a lot of them read Barbara Ward, and I wanted to understand what was the kind of like moment that they came from, and not just to root it within a volume and growth of NGOs in the 60s, but really to understand the kind of solution that a lot of people thought that NGOs can provide, like solutions to what? Why was it so important to turn to these nonprofits and to these particular programs? So yes, I mean, I don't know if that's like answering it completely. I don't know what kind of history I'm writing at this point. I'm just trying to figure out a new project. But I mean, I like the idea of thinking about ideas in action, because I think that there's particular ways in which I find it really fascinating and interesting to trace the political and economic ideas that underwrite a lot of, and I think that by tracing those ideas, I can maybe tease out certain alternatives, which is why I like this kind of history of political and economic thought. It offers a certain type of capaciousness to the different types of routes that might have been taken. But they cannot be understood in isolation from the ways in which they were practiced and from action for me, because I also need this type of like a certain type of political economy in which they operate, and the ways in which they were used in the projects and programs that I trace. So I'm unsatisfied with just intellectual history if I don't look at the action and the way in which they were practiced. So the real crescendo, comes for me in the story when I look at how some ideas were ditched and some were actually put into practice, and what happened to them when they put into practice, and how they were twisted and received new meanings. Yeah, I think that's sort of where I stand.
I mean, I think it's a very productive tension in your work between an intellectual and social history. I enjoy that balance. I think Peter Gay called it the social history of ideas, if you want to run with that. Pretty old fashioned, but I like it. So we have a question from James Vernon. I don't know if this counts as a plant or not, but I'll go ahead and read it anyway. Can you say more about the nonprofit sector and its relationship to the market? Do you see that sector as expanding in these decades, or just changing in its relationship to economic life at home and in former colonies, or is it both? And how would that story in Britain relate to what is happening to the nonprofit world elsewhere, probably especially in the US? A lot there. But obviously, I think, for me, one of the big contributions of the book was, as you said, to locate the origins of neoliberalism, not in the think tanks, not in the political right at all, but in this nonprofit world. So yeah, perhaps you want to say more about that as well.
Yeah, so maybe I should say first that I call them nonprofits. Most people, when they write about Oxfam, War and Want, Christian Aid, Save the Children, they write and think about these organizations, and rightfully, this is not a critique, but to say that they have been written about and thought about through the story of politics, so either through charities, which is how they're called in Britain, and there's a lot of literature that comes from Britain, so they're using the term charity, or as NGOs and non-governmental organizations, which put them within this kind of story of governance. So they've been thought of in relationship to international politics or to domestic politics through the rise of the voluntary sector. And I call them nonprofits, which is kind of maybe peculiar, because the whole point is I'm trying to talk about profit and ethical profit, because I want to kind of tease out a certain tension of how these nonprofits, as we will call them in the United States, in Britain also, as one would call them in the United States, were creating a certain type of solutions that would generate profit. So they were either creating fair trade programs. In some cases, these nonprofits created their own limited liability companies. Some cases, they worked with the for-profit sector. So their relationship to the market is one in which, even though they're exempt of tax, so their kind of status as a charity and as a nonprofit exempts them from tax because they're supposed to non-generate profit, they always have a certain type of relationship to the world of profit. And one of the things, for example, that I show is how a lot of these charity taxation was even kind of developed during this period through these fair trade ventures. So, charity shops, for example, that we normally associate with this kind of very domestic, peculiar story in Britain, were actually developed and grown through projects of development, and then organizations like Oxfam were appealing to a certain type of charity exemptions and were lobbying for it, and they got a certain type of exemption by creating limited liability companies that would then import certain products and kind of facilitated this entire development programs of fair trade of both food and fair trade of handicraft. And then there is like a whole story of the for-profit world. There's ways in which like the Intermediate Technologies Development Group worked with British businesses to facilitate different types of development programs. So I hope that answers at least part of it. I don't know if I fully can answer how it relates to the United States, but I mean, there's both like a growth of nonprofits in this period, and in terms of volume, in terms of numbers, as well as a change, a qualitative change of what they are. I mean, I think that they become, one of the arguments that I'm making in the book is they become really important actors in the British economy as well as in the global economy. So that's sort of like one of the main interventions of the book, that we shouldn't be thinking about them just as this kind of actors within politics, but actually actors within the economy itself, and they become real stakeholders in the British economy.
Have you gotten any kind of feedback or reaction from Oxfam at any point during the research, or now that the book is out? Just curious, and do you expect that will affect the reception at all in Britain?
I don't know. I mean, I've met a lot of former Oxfam people here that sort of like, I think, are very much influenced by like the donut economics, if you know that, all this kind of like conversation about that. So I think it kind of resonate with them. Yeah, that's sort of like my only really. I mean, it's still early. I moved like 3 weeks ago. I'm sure
It'll be interesting.
Seems like Oxford is either people that work for Oxford or for Oxfam. So
I think we have maybe time for one more question before we run out, and unless someone runs into the chat, it's going to be my question. Okay. So this is kind of the unfair question to ask last. I wanted to ask about your use of the term neoliberalism, which, as you know, is not uncontroversial. I think it's fair to say it's applied very broadly. There's a kind of expansionism associated with the term. Theories, policies, economic arrangements, culture can all be described as neoliberal. There seems not to be agreement necessarily even on, say, what does neoliberalism have to say about the market or the state, right? These are contested questions itself. So could you just say a little bit, by way of conclusion, about why you find it a useful term?
yeah.
I'm sorry. That was a bit of a sandbag at the end, but anyway. But I would really be curious.
Have another hour.
Exactly. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I should say that, my contribution to the conversation is to say what we associate as neoliberalism is not just a story of the right, but is a story that came also from the left. So that's sort of like something that I kind of want to put as like the kind of main kind of quick an immediate answer to this. I thought, I don't have any objections of using the term. I find the conversation of whether or not we should use the term pretty exhausting. By this point, I feel like the way that I used to be against it, and then the way that I think about it now is that the term is clearly very successful because it generated a whole literature. And so we should definitely use it because it's rich enough for us to create a full-on historical, debates and conversations about what is neoliberalism, what is not, even whether or not it is useful, already produced a certain type of ways of analyzing the period in a very nuanced way that if we wouldn't have used it, we might not have reached there, right?
Great
So
utilitarian defense, yeah.
I think that, from a kind of methodological and historiographical lens, I think that the term is rich and we should definitely use it. I think that again, the way that I use it is to think about what we normally commonly associate with neoliberalism. So to work with a certain type of commonsensical definition of it. And rather than to provide a new definition for it, which is one mode of writing about neoliberalism, I don't do that. Instead, I say, okay, we normally think of anti-statism, of entrepreneurship, of kind of pro-market, even of individualism or individualization as a story that comes from the failure of social democracy, the triumph of very kind of market-driven, totalitarian or authoritarian policymakers or economists normally coming from the right. But there's a whole rich way of thinking and acting in the 50s and the 60s in Britain that was experimenting and thinking about a lot of these ideas. So entrepreneurship is a good example. For E.F. Schumacher, entrepreneurship was a solution of making the producer the owner of their own labor. And for him, that was a very left-wing way of thinking about entrepreneurship. Today, we associate kind of the term to entrepreneurialism by looking at Thatcher, that's like the kind of main. So I try to work and say, okay, but there's ways in which this was also kind of a legacy of a certain liberal left. I hope that answers.
No, it absolutely does. I think we're out of time anyway, but I think that was a very convincing defense, actually, of the use of neoliberalism. Like I said, on utilitarian grounds, if nothing else. By the way, as we go, maybe your next project should be an intellectual biography of King Charles III, who was obsessed with Schumacher, as I understand it. He really, Small is Beautiful was a huge influence on him early on. So I don't know, maybe it's an article anyway, just worth toying with there. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this fantastic discussion. Tehila, congratulations on a fantastic book. I hope we can talk more about it sometime. Yeah, it's been great. And I'll send things back to Amanda.
No, thank you both. I hope that everyone will join me in thanking Tehila and Erik for excellent moderating. This was a great discussion, and we hope to see you all at some of our other events. And also, just as a side note, we just sent out also the discount flyer for the book, so you can check your inbox for that. And all right, hope everyone will join me in thanking them.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Congratulations, Tehila. It's great.